Hello Octaners, I'm recording this on March 24th from my home close to Vancouver, Canada, where I'm currently in isolation during the ongoing pandemic. I was hoping to give this talk in San Francisco next week, but if everything goes as currently planned, you're watching this at 11 a.m. on April 1st, from wherever you happen to be in the world over the internet. I believe that there is a chat system in place, which means that you may have the unusual and perhaps interesting opportunity to talk to me on the chat at the same time as you listen to me talk on the video, if that makes any sense. I'd like to start this talk with a question that a lot of you have probably been asked, most likely by less technical friends or family members. Can you build a completely secure computer system? Now, if you're like me, meaning rather sarcastic, you've probably given an answer something like this. Sure, you just take your computer system, turn it off, encase it in concrete, and drop it in the ocean. Nobody can get to it, nobody can break into it. Now, this joke started going around at least 2 decades ago, but unlike 20 years ago, we now have an experimental proof of security for this. The search for the wreckage of flight MH370 involved several countries, and over $100 million was spent looking for that plane. We didn't find it. Eventually, parts of the plane, parts of the wreckage started washing up on islands in the South Indian Ocean. And that was a plane. It had an acoustic transponder, which was designed to make it easy to locate. We had telemetry from satellites, which gave us some idea of where to look for it, and we still couldn't find it. Fact is, if you drop a computer at a random location in the ocean, nobody is ever going to find it. That will be an incredibly secure computer system. Of course, it won't have to be a very useful computer system. Any data you have on it, yeah, nobody else will be able to access it, but you won't be able to access it either. So here we have, admittedly a rather extreme example, but a trade-off between security and usability. And for the rest of this talk, I want to discuss some of the ways that you can make these trade-offs, some of the ways that you can have more security if you're less concerned about what you can do with the system. So I'm giving this talk because I got an email in December from Okta saying, we'd love to have you give a 45-minute talk on storing sensitive data securely. And I thought about this for a while, and I decided, I really can't cover this in 45 minutes. Storing sensitive data securely, it's such a broad topic, and what works for one person in one situation will not necessarily work in a different situation. So you have to ask yourself, what constraints do you have? And on the flip side of that, what limitations are you willing to accept? If you need to be able to access your data all of the time, then you're more constrained in how you can secure it than if it's something that you can lock away in a bank vault. You need to think about who you need to keep the data secure from. If you're worried about your kid sister, your kid brother, you're probably less worried about it than if you're trying to keep secrets from, say, the US National Security Agency. Somewhere in between, you've got organized crime, you've got competitors. You need to think about what resources they're willing to spend. If you have a secret cure for COVID-19, the US government is probably going to be willing to spend a lot to try to get their hands on it. If, say, you cheated on your taxes and you lied about being a billionaire, the US government might not care so much. They might be able to get the information, but not willing to spend what it would cost them to get it. Finally, what do you mean by secure anyway? In information security, we often talk about the InfoSec triad, consisting of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. When people talk about keeping sensitive data secure, they're usually thinking about confidentiality, but you can't forget about the other two completely. So ultimately, this talk is not going to be giving you the answers because there's just far too many possibilities. I cannot give you the answers for every possible situation. But what I hope you'll get out of this talk is that I can help you think about the right questions you need to ask yourself in order to come to the right answers yourself. So the first question you have to ask yourself is, do you need the information you're dealing with? And the second question is, do you still need the information? Companies tend to act like pack rats. They'll gather all the information they can possibly get their hands on, stash it away, because, after all, hard drive are cheap these days, and eventually some of it might be useful. Most of it probably won't, but the information which is useful at some point in the future, they can't predict which information it will be, so just hold on to everything and, better to have it than not have it. Well, it may be better from the perspective of that is valuable information, and some of it is valuable at least, but it's also risky. And as information security professionals, it may be up to you to remind your companies that every time they're storing additional information, they're taking on an additional risk. The risk that that information may be compromised, may be disclosed, and the company may look very bad if it turns out that they were hoarding this information unnecessarily, not to mention, of course, possible issues with regulators. The second question, of course, do you still need the information? There are many times that there's a legitimate reason for gathering information in the first place. You may need it for a short time, but once you're finished with it, it may be you do not need it for a long period, or it may be that you can aggregate the information or anonymize the information somehow so that if it gets leaked at a future point, the damage is reduced. Remember, risk is not just the probability of something bad happening, but also considers the damage which is caused if that bad thing happens. There's a few specific cases I want to talk about here because they come up a lot. Credit card numbers. Ideally, you're not dealing with credit card numbers. If you can possibly avoid it, do not deal with credit card numbers. You can use many online credit card processing systems now. You load JavaScript from their servers, and when a user enters a credit card number, it will go directly to their servers. You get a token back, you can store that token. You never have the credit card numbers on your system. But if for some reason you have to have credit card numbers on your server, the first thing you should do, send it to that credit card processing service, get a token back from them, and then wipe that credit card number from memory. Let Stripe or Square or whichever service you're using, let them deal with the risk of storing the credit card numbers. This isn't something that you want to be doing. This is probably not something that you are equipped to handle from a security perspective. Those tokens, those are safe. So you can store those, not worry so much about the security. Only bad things will happen from you trying to store the credit card numbers yourself. Passwords. You've got users logging into your website. They enter a password. It arrives at your server. The first thing you should do, run that password through some form of key derivation function, also known as a password hash. Personally, I recommend script. It's the key derivation function I designed for Tarsnap about 10 years ago. But you could use Argon 2, you could use bcrypt, you could use pbkdf2. Ultimately, the choice of password hash is probably going to depend on any existing database you have of passwords for users before you wrote your code, if you're upgrading an existing system, or simply what you have convenient libraries for in the language you're using. The choice of password hash is not very important. The most important thing is, as soon as you get the password, you hash it, and then you wipe the password from memory. You do not want to have those passwords on your system any longer than you need them, and once you have the hash, anything you're doing with passwords should be just done with a hash. You use a hash to check if the password is correct, for instance. Cryptographic keys and credentials. I see a lot of programs written where from the main function, they load keys into memory. Say there's a parameter on the command line saying, go look in this file here for the keys. And sometimes those keys get used. Often they're not used because the way that the program behaves depends on other options passed to it, which commands you're running, which operations you're performing. But the keys are in memory from the very beginning until the very end when the program exits. This just increases the risk, increases the potential for those keys to be leaked. Now, it makes sense to check that the key file exists, but don't actually read those keys into memory until you know that you need them. It just makes sense to not expose them any more than you need to. One caveat here when I talk about wiping information from memory or sanitizing information, this isn't always easy. In fact, it can be very difficult. Experienced C developers will be familiar with the concept of dead store elimination, where the compiler can say, oh, you're mem setting a buffer and then you're going to free that memory allocation. We can just get rid of that mem set because, yeah, nobody's going to be reading that buffer anyway. In C, we now have the memset_s function, which is guaranteed to actually perform the memory setting, even if it's a dead store. But this doesn't completely solve the problem. Compilers can make temporary copies of your data. They can copy it onto the stack. They can load, in fact, you almost always will, load your data into registers. This is particularly an issue with AES keys because the x86 instructions for performing AES operations load all those keys into the XMM registers. So it is difficult to ensure that anything that you'd want to wipe from memory is in fact completely gone from the system, but do your best. At worst, you wasted a few clock cycles. At best, it avoided having some information leak to an attacker. So suppose you've decided that you really do need to still hold on to some information. The next question you need to ask yourself is, when do you need that information? Do you need it continuously, all the time? Or is it enough that you can access it occasionally when you need it? And if you only need to access the information occasionally, do you need to be able to access it immediately or very quickly? Or is it enough that you can eventually get your hands on it? Having a window pop up saying, insert your YubiKey to proceed, will protect you against many, many automated attacks. There are many attacks out there which will leak the contents of memory. If your keys are on a YubiKey, then they're not in memory. They're not going to be leaked at that point. There are attacks which can access anything which is currently connected to the system, but if the YubiKey is not currently plugged in, you're safe. If you don't need to access the information as immediately, an encrypted USB disk which is locked in a bank vault protects you against far more attacks. For instance, somebody can steal a YubiKey. It's quite a bit more difficult to steal a USB disk from a bank vault. On the flip side, if your data is locked in a bank vault, it may take you 72 hours or more to retrieve it. If on a Friday before Memorial Day, you realize you need the data, you might not get it back until Tuesday morning. But for some purposes, that may be fine. Now, you need to think about exactly what those situations are. If that USB disk has keys for retrieving backups of your payroll data, for instance, that's probably fine if you have to wait 72 hours. You probably didn't need the payroll data before Tuesday morning anyway. On the other hand, if it has signing keys for your mobile app, well, if on Friday night you discover there's a critical security vulnerability in your app, you might not want to wait until Tuesday morning before you can release a new version of it. So think carefully about how long you can wait to get your data back. But in some cases, you can just lock the information away, and it makes it a lot safer that way. That said, you have to remember, anytime you're talking about keeping data offline, that mostly offline data, it's still occasionally online. And so when you take that disk out of the bank vault, plug it into your laptop, then suddenly it's online and it can be attacked. So you may need to think about, say, with that USB disk with the encrypted keys on it, only plug it into a system which is not connected to the internet. If you've decided that you need your data continuously available, immediately available, ask yourself, does it need to be immediately available in both directions? There's a lot of systems which log data or perform backups, and they don't necessarily need to be able to read data back. If you can design a system which is append only, and critically here it needs to be append only, not write only, because you don't want attackers to overwrite your backups or your logs, then the worst that somebody can do is log extra garbage if they get into your system. Now, this may be a problem. If you've got a logging system, you may not want an attacker to be able to fill your disk with garbage and then stop you from logging anything else. But at very least, a logging system like that would be able to record everything before the attacker got in, and perhaps record how they got in the process. As a general rule, whenever feasible, you want to split large systems into smaller systems which have more restricted privileges. If you can take a large system, particularly one which interacts with users, anybody external, because that's how attackers would typically get in, and split it into a system where one part is, say, only appending to a log, and then something on the back end that users don't have any access to is reading information out, that makes it a lot harder for an attacker to do anything evil to you. Can you specify any constraints on how your data is accessed, and then store it in a system which enforces those constraints? For instance, hardware security modules are designed to perform cryptographic operations for you, but while you can put new keys into them, you cannot get the keys they store back out, depending on the HSM, but this is generally how they work. So if somebody gains access to your HSM, then they can decrypt data, they can sign data, but they can't get the keys out, which means that at some point you hopefully realize they have access to the system, and you can remove their access, and they no longer have the keys. If you know an upper bound on the number of operations per second which you're going to need to perform, you can build a system which is simply physically incapable of going any faster. And this may be able to limit the damage that an attacker can cause, even if you can't keep them out completely. So, for instance, going back to the example of credit card numbers, the Visa network advertises that they can perform about 30,000 credit card operations per second. Well, if for some reason you have a system which stores credit card numbers, and you see 60,000 Visa cards being accessed every second, something's wrong there, because there's no way that there's that many operations actually happening over the Visa network from you, so that must mean that somebody has broken into your system and is trying to steal all the cards. So if you can design your system so that it is not capable of revealing credit card numbers faster than that, then even if somebody gains complete system access, you can at least limit the damage they cause, reduce the number of credit cards they can steal. So I've said a bit about how your system is designed and the ways that restrictions, constraints on your system can help you design more secure systems. Now I want to talk about people, and starting with a question, what's wrong with this picture? This is a photo taken from the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency about 2 years ago. This was shortly after they accidentally warned everybody in Hawaii that there was a nuclear missile inbound. And this picture circulated quite widely at the time. If you look closely on the bottom right corner, you'll see there's a post-it note attached to a monitor. And although you can't see it with this resolution, that post-it note has a password written on it. This circulated quite widely, with people laughing about the fact that this agency has passwords written on post-it notes attached to monitors. Well, the fact is, people are really, really bad at picking and memorizing passwords. About 15 years ago, researchers at Microsoft found an average password strength of about 40 bits, even for banking websites. I think they looked at Bank of America and PayPal, among others. 40 bits, I mean, you're not going to guess that password just typing things in randomly. If you know something about the user, you may be able to narrow that down. If you steal a database of password hashes, you can crack that pretty quickly. And password policies don't actually help you very much. The password which was written on that sticky note was warning point 2 with a capital W and the digit 2 at the end. I would guess that whatever service it was that was the password to had a password policy that said you have to have at least one capital letter and you have to have at least one digit. This is what we typically see when you enforce policies like that. You tell people you need to have a digit, they add a digit at the end. You tell them they need to have a capital letter, they capitalize the first letter. In fact, when you ask people to change their password frequently, you'll often end up with them just incrementing that last digit. So I wouldn't be surprised if 3 months before this photo was taken, they had a password of warning point 1. It is really difficult to get users to pick strong passwords, and especially difficult to get them to memorize them. So if your office is physically secure, you might actually be better having a strong random password, which is written on that post-it note, rather than asking your users to remember something, because they're going to pick something weak, they're going to have trouble remembering it. Passwords which are on post-it notes, on whiteboards, on wikis, they can also be rotated more easily. If you're relying on humans remembering things, they don't like it when you tell them you have to pick a new password. They'll usually pick a new password which is very similar to the old password. If you have your passwords in a wiki or on the whiteboard, you can generate a complete new random password. And yeah, they can't remember it. Or well, they just look it up. Now, this relies on your office being physically secure, but there are places which are physically secure, and in those places, maybe don't put it on a post-it note if you have media coming in taking photos, but if you have a binder sitting on your desk marked passwords to everything, that might be better than just relying on humans remembering things. Now, of course, I'm sure you're all saying, well, weak passwords, that's why we have two-factor or multi-factor authentication. But the problem is, you're only as secure as the factors that you use. Well, what do people use most often? SMS messages. My bank uses SMS messages, Stripe uses SMS messages, but these can be intercepted. The phone system is ultimately not secure. They can be intercepted by setting up fake cell phone towers that your phones will connect to. They can be intercepted by calling up the phone network and saying, hey, I lost my phone. I don't have my SIM card. I just bought a new one. Can you connect this to my account? They can be intercepted by calling up a different phone company and saying, hey, I want to switch to your service. Yes, this is who I am. This is my phone number. Theoretically, the phone companies are supposed to check, but you're dealing with untrained technical support staff. They're not thinking about security. They're thinking about getting through that call quickly so that they can meet their targets for how many seconds they spend on each call. If you're relying on the security of the phone system, you really do not have much security against any sort of sophisticated attacker. And then, of course, devices can be stolen, and that applies to phones or other sorts of devices like key fobs. Another thing to consider about key fobs, most of them will rely on third parties to keep cryptographic keys secure. RSA fobs, they have a key which is inside the device, and there's a database that tells the company for the device with a certain serial number what the key is in that device. And that key gets used to generate the random seeming numbers that you have every 30 seconds, every 60 seconds, every time you press a button, however it works. But you have to ask yourself, if a company is willing to use a backdoored random number generator, will they keep your keys secret if the NSA asks them? I don't know, but it's something to worry about if you're concerned about the sorts of attackers that can call up a company and say, yeah, we'd really like you to do this for us. Can your attacker gain physical access to your servers? In most cases, having physical access will mean complete system compromise. There's serial consoles, there's USB hardware interface devices, which may look like a USB stick but actually pretend to be a keyboard and then type things into the console. There's FireWire direct memory access. There's auto-mounted file systems. Even without things like the Windows Auto Run that we're all aware of now, file system code tends to be very, very poor quality code, and corrupted file systems on pretty much every system out there can cause arbitrary code execution. So if you're automating file systems from anything that gets plugged in, you're vulnerable to that sort of attack. And then, of course, cold boot attacks, turn off the system, and then read information out of memory before the DRAM degrades. The one exception to this, if you're lucky, is hardware security modules. But you have to be lucky. Theoretically, they're designed to protect against an attacker who has physical access. In practice, there have been many, many attacks over the years looking at side channel attacks on them, whether it's power consumption, or acoustic attacks, or X-raying the systems, fault attacks of many different sorts. If you're lucky, it will stop the attacker. It will probably stop a less sophisticated attacker. If you're dealing with a very sophisticated attacker, I would not trust an HSM to keep your information secure. People often talk about data being encrypted at rest, but it's very important to remember that is only useful if your data is at rest. So your servers sitting in a data center with encrypted disks, which are mounted, that data is not at rest. That data is being accessed continuously. The keys are in memory. The data can be accessed. Any attacker that gains access to the system can access that data. Encrypted at rest is useful for laptops, which are turned off, not in sleep mode, but if they're turned off. It's useful for backup tapes. It's useful for if you turn off those servers, put them into moving vans, and drive them to a different data center. But for an active server in a data center, encrypted at rest is really not going to be useful to you. You need to think about whether an attacker can compromise your desktops, your laptops, and your phones. Maybe all of the important data is on the servers, but you're probably not accessing those servers by walking up to them and typing in at the console. You're probably accessing them through your desktops, your laptops, and your phones. And if the attacker can compromise the systems that you're using to access the servers, they don't need to compromise the servers directly. They can just go in the same way that you do. OpenSSH has had many security vulnerabilities over the years. Standard SSH server for almost all servers out there run it. It has 112,000 lines of code. Chromium has 34 million lines of code. It's about 300 times more complicated. Well, I have a lot of faith in the Google team. They do great work, they have fantastic security people, but between 34 million lines of code and 112,000 lines of code, I have to say Chromium is more likely to have security vulnerabilities than OpenSSH. So, although 30 years ago we tended to have very simple clients talking to relatively complicated servers, the situation is entirely reversed now. Servers tend to be very simple, running very small amounts of code. Client systems have ridiculously large amounts of code and probably a lot of security vulnerabilities. So think very carefully about the servers think very carefully about the desktops and laptops and phones you're using to access your servers. That said, compromising a client and then leveraging it to extract information from a server requires a more sophisticated attacker. There's many attacks out there and attackers which just sort of spray servers, run an exploit against every IP address out there, and if they don't get into the server, they move on. An attacker which is going to be attacking a client system, that's probably somebody who knows your setup, they know who you are, know how you access the server from your desktop. So they're a more sophisticated attacker, somebody who is pinpointing you as a target specifically, but it's not impossible. It's something that you need to worry about if you're concerned about the more sophisticated attackers. You have to think about, can an attacker compromise your people? Intelligence agencies have traditionally relied on the 3 Bs: bribery, burglary, and blackmail. Attacking cryptography is something which is very modern from their perspective. They've been applying these techniques for many decades. And even if you say that you trust your employees wonderfully, so okay, maybe they won't take bribes, but it's not reasonable to expect them to not take any jail time to keep your secrets. This is particularly an issue if you have dual nationals, say US-Chinese dual citizens, and the other country that they're a citizen of does not respect the concept of dual nationality. If somebody gets arrested in China, and the Chinese government wants to know about your company, they may be locked up until they tell the Chinese government everything the Chinese government wants to know about your company. And I hope that you will not expect them to stay locked up for a long time, because if they have any sense, they won't stay locked up for a long time. If you ensure that anything important requires approval from 2 people, or accessing data, if you use secret sharing schemes to protect the data, that will protect you from having a compromised employee. More importantly, it also protects the compromised employee. If that employee who got detained in China cannot give the Chinese government anything sensitive about your company, the Chinese government will let them go. Obviously, they'll need to explain why they can't provide anything sensitive, but if you're protected from a compromised employee, then your employees are also protected from coercion. With my own startup, Tarsnap, it's an online backup service, and of course, being a cryptographer, I wanted to do the best thing I could as far as security went, so I used end-to-end security. But it wasn't just because I wanted to build the most secure system possible. I also wanted to ensure that nobody would ever come after me wanting me to disclose my customers' secrets. Because the data is end-to-end secure, it protects me from any risk of being coerced to do something that, because of the end-to-end security, I cannot do. Now, it may be that you're worried about an attacker who is able to compromise your data, either through attacking your servers, the client systems, your people. But you should also think about whether the attacker will be willing to pay the cost of attacking you. The CIA, if they want to, they can kidnap you, they can torture you, they have Guantanamo Bay. But they probably won't, because kidnapping people, torturing them, it tends to hurt presidential re-election chances. They tend to get in trouble when the media finds out. They can do this, but it's too much of a cost. Now, if you have the secret cure for COVID-19, they may do it anyway, and they may be willing to go to the media and say, yeah, we tortured this guy, but it was worth it because it will save millions of lives. But if you have something less sensitive than that, they probably won't be willing to take that risk. They won't be willing to pay that cost. Nation-state attackers routinely stockpile software vulnerabilities. They have huge teams of people out there finding vulnerabilities, and they're just holding on to them because they're worried when the next cyber war comes, whether it's a war against China or against North Korea or against Russia, they want to be able to use these to attack computer systems. Well, they're stockpiling these for future use, and if they use these vulnerabilities against you, which they could do, but if they use them, there's a chance that you would notice what the vulnerability is. You might start using it yourself against somebody else, or you might realize what the vulnerability is and get it fixed, at which point they have one less weapon in their arsenal. So they may be able to attack you, but not want to pay that price. There's many unethical amateurs out there who will discover vulnerabilities in servers, but legal consequences often deter them. Organized crime, of course, they're willing to break the law, but there's many people out there who, if they think they won't get caught, they'll poke around. They're curious, but if they're worried about getting caught, they'll say, "Yeah, I'll just stop there. Maybe I'll send them an email telling them I found this vulnerability. Maybe they'll give me a bounty or something." But people think about the risks before they do things. Ultimately, anything you can do that assists in a post-mortem of any data compromise will increase the cost to an attacker and potentially dissuade them. Any logging you do, which increases the chances you can figure out who broke into your system and how they broke into the system, that will make it more likely that you can track down that unethical amateur, get them thrown in jail maybe, or discover the vulnerability that the NSA was using to hack into your system. If they think that you're going to catch them, they're less likely to attack you. Now, I've talked a lot about keeping data confidential. I want to touch briefly on the topic of backups, partly because I run a backup service, but also because one of the three pillars of the InfoSec triad I mentioned before is availability. And ransomware is a big thing out there these days. You do not want to lose your data. So obviously, the best way to avoid losing data is to have good backups. We often say there's two types of people in the world: people who have good backups and people who have not lost data yet. But it's not enough to have backups. You also need to have restores. So you should ask yourself, when was the last time you tested restoring a backup? I run a backup service. I can see how much traffic is coming in, how much traffic is going out. And I can say, from the users of my service, who are generally pretty smart people, a lot of them are not testing their backups. Because if they were, there would be a lot more data going out of the system. But, okay, so you're testing your backups. That's good. When was the last time you tested restoring a backup while pretending that a city was hit by a natural disaster? When Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, there were companies which had their data in one building in New Orleans, and they lost their data, and their backups were in the basement of another building in New Orleans, which got flooded, and they lost their backups. On a more macabre note, when 9/11 attacks hit New York, there were companies which had their backups in the basement of the other twin tower. If you're relying on offsite backups which are in the same city, that's not really good enough. Offsite backups should be as far away as possible. You should also think about whether you can restore your backups while pretending that a critical employee is on vacation or sick or maybe has just been fired. I've had several emails over the years from customers saying things like, "We just lost our data, we need to restore our backups, but our sysadmin just went on his honeymoon and we won't be able to contact him for 2 weeks." Or, even worse, "We just fired our sysadmin, he destroyed all of our data on his way out, and he's the only guy who has the passphrases to access our backups." Make sure you're not in that situation. If only one person can restore your data, you do not have good backups. And finally, think about, can an attacker do anything evil if they can read or tamper with your backups? There have been many instances over the years where unencrypted backups have been lost in the mail. Companies, whether using traditional postal mail or a courier service, things get lost. And if those backups aren't encrypted, or potentially if they can be tampered with in some way, you're in trouble. So make sure that you have good security on your backups. Now, as a cryptographer, I imagine that you were all waiting for me to talk about cryptography, and up to this point I haven't, for a very important reason, which is cryptography usually does not solve problems for you. Typically, it transforms hard security problems into hard key management problems. If an attacker can access your keys, then they can access the data that the keys are protecting. And protecting keys is generally as difficult as protecting the data in the first place. Now, there's two exceptions to this. First, cryptography allows you to split control of the data. So there's secret sharing schemes that I mentioned before, but also cryptography lets you do things like having a USB stick which has the data on it encrypted, and then a separate USB stick which contains the keys, or a USB stick which is encrypted and then a person is remembering the passphrase. This allows you to separate the control so that if only one of those is compromised, the data is still secure. The other thing that cryptography lets you do is time shift secure data transfer. So you can negotiate keys securely now, and you can use them later. This is useful if, say, you have somebody coming to your office and you can physically hand him a key containing the keys, a USB stick containing the keys. You don't need to worry about, is the mail secure? But these are rare exceptions. In general, key management is very difficult and almost as difficult as all the other security problems that you've been thinking about. So cryptography is not a magic bullet. Ultimately, storing data securely is the wrong question to ask. Your data will be secure if and only if all of the ways that your data can be accessed are secure. So don't think about the data being secure, think about the ways that you access it being secure. And a lot of this will come down to people. Not just the people who should be accessing your data, but the attackers who shouldn't be accessing it. So think about the people, think about the potential attackers, and it's up to you to decide which attackers you're worried about. Maybe you're not worried about the US government. Maybe you think the NSA is wonderful and they would never hurt anybody. That's up to you, but think about the people. And while we're thinking about people, it's very difficult times out there, so I hope you'll all stay safe and keep calm and wash your hands. Thank you.